Hello everyone, this is Chidam Knebel. Welcome to 2017 Fall Parents Dyslexia Summit. Our guest today is Nancy Duggan. Nancy is the co-founder and executive director of Decoding Dyslexia, Massachusetts. She has a master's degree in counseling and is a licensed school counselor. She's a trained reading specialist, including the orthogonal method, and a professional member of the International Dyslexia Association. She is on the advisory group for the International Foundation for the Effective Reading Instruction and represents Decoding Dyslexia in the Coalition for Reading Excellence. Welcome, Nancy, to the summit. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chidam. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Every time I talk to you, I learn so much. So I thought you would be a great guest for our summit. And I know that we want to talk about how parents can get the support to navigate through the school system and give the right education to their children. But maybe before that, we can start with that. What is dyslexia? How do we define it? And then we can dive into the tools and the strategies for parents.
Thanks. It's such a pleasure to be here, Chidam, and I do enjoy helping students and parents figure out exactly what they need to get the right reading instruction. So you had suggested that we would start with the definition of dyslexia, and I'm going to just put this on the screen share so that everyone can see. On our website for Decoding Dyslexia in Massachusetts, we have some information, and the very first thing I hope people will look at is the definition of dyslexia. And so rather than read the whole thing, I send people there to sort of look at it. But in bold, we have that it's neurobiological, and that's important for parents and even students and teachers to understand, because it's not something that they did wrong. It's not something that it's not something they can control. Dyslexia is just trouble learning how to read. Basically, that's the most simplest definition. But why kids have trouble learning how to read can vary. And for some kids, it's really the way brains organize, the way all brains organize. But for some kids, to get from spoken language to being able to use written language, either in reading or in writing, involves some neurological or some brain processes that some kids have trouble with early on. Dyslexia is not something that prevents a child from learning to read. It just makes reading more difficult. So if we look at reading and what it is, and then we look at what the difference is in processing that dyslexia causes, we can match the challenges that the child is having with the important components of learning to read. So pretty much it's sort of like making a pathway in kids' brains to learn to read. And if there's a roadblock, we want to know about that roadblock so we can go around it. So what we're going to talk about today is if anybody's used those, those special GPS systems where they tell you, where the traffic or the roadblock's going to be. Today, I hope to give parents sort of a heads up on how to find the roadblocks before you get stuck in traffic or stopped completely from reaching the destination of reading, and how to go around that and how to get a good access to reading for your children. So let's start with the definition of reading. And interestingly enough, Congress has done us a favor. They have actually described reading, and they have described the essential components of reading. So I'm going to put that up for you in just a second. So let's pause here for a second while I get that up. So what's important to know about your journey on this is that the law and the law that comes before you helps you as parents. And I like to start explaining about this to parents because a recent Supreme Court decision had Justice Roberts saying something very important to parents in his opinion after they heard the trial. And he said, educators and the team needs to give a cogent and responsive explanation for the services listed and provided in an IEP. So if your child already has an IEP, this will be helpful to you, what we're about to do, and also if you are trying to establish an IEP for your student. And when you're looking for that cogent and responsive explanation, I really think anyone can use the details that have been drafted by Congress as the definition of reading. And here they are. So if reading, according to Congress, is the skills and knowledge to understand how phonemes or speech sounds are connected to print, and reading is the ability to decode unfamiliar words, or the ability to read fluently. Those are the three initial steps that kids need. Simultaneously going on next to that, as those three things are building in your child's ability, sufficient background information and vocabulary, which you can have background information and vocabulary even without reading, right? You can get that from speech or from watching video. So that's happens simultaneously. And then the development of appropriate active strategies to construct meaning from print is also sort of an overarching thing. Someone needs to teach you these strategies. You just don't walk down the street and all of a sudden you're going to read. And the development and maintenance of a motivation to read, one of the critical components to motivation to read is gradual success. You know, nobody wants to do something that when they keep trying and trying, they can't do. So let's put those bottom three aside for a second and know that those are happening simultaneously. And let's look at what is reading from the point of view of your young child that goes to kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and is learning to read. Okay, because we really separate school years of a typical child in the learning to read phase, which would be pre-K, first grade, second grade, and then third grade sort of pulls it all together into reading fluently. And then those grades after where we use reading to learn. Reading then becomes a tool to learn other things. So in those initial years, what are we looking at? We're looking at the first three components. So the term reading is a complex system. It's deriving meaning from print, and it requires all the following of these things, but the first three are foundational, and they build on each other like a house of cards. If you don't have the skills and knowledge to understand the sounds of language, speech sounds, and how to connect them to print, it's going to be very difficult for you to ever read fluently. Okay, so we want to build, a strong foundation and not something that's, not going to hold up for kids. And we want to start at that very basic level. And so Congress also has, I'm going to sort of slide this up now, and you're going to see the essential components of reading instruction. Now, this is also part of the U.S. Code. Congress put this in writing. The essential components of reading include explicit and systematic instruction. Now, explicit, what does that mean? That means we're directly going to teach each skill. Okay, so implicit learning, you can, do an experiment and learn that the first 2 tries didn't work. That's something that happens as you kind of go forward. But explicit instruction is when someone shows you, and I'll give a language example. For instance, the letter A can make a number of sounds in English, one of the sounds being the long A sound. But we need to be taught when an A makes an A sound or when it makes a short A sound. Okay, so assuming that a child will understand the differences in a given text would be just implicit. But explicit would say, we're going to show you how to recognize when the letter A makes a long sound, when the letter A makes a short sound, and in fact, what are all the different ways to make the A sound in English? And so, for instance, you could have the word cake, and the A says the long sound because it's followed by a consonant and a silent E. That's one of the rules. But in the number 8, when we spell that, E-I-G-H-T, the E-I-G-H also makes the A sound, okay? So connecting sounds that we make when we say A and 8, or cake, or 8 cakes, there were 8 cakes on the table. Those are lots of long A sounds. And how do we recognize those to make those sounds? And how do we not confuse them with the, with the hat and the cat sound? Okay, explicit teaching doesn't leave that up for guessing or figuring it out along the way, trial and error. The explicit way is going to teach you all the sounds, and there are 44 sounds in English and over 70 ways to spell them. So explicit instruction would include all those sounds. So right away, this explicit as part of Congress's instructions to, to how to instruct for reading is very important for kids with dyslexia. Because although some kids might implicitly learn some of those rules I just described, watching Sesame Street and being read to, many other children need it to be explicitly taught. Okay? And systematic instruction is also important. Starting with the small, starting strong, starting with good, strong skills in a small area and then building on them, systematically following a sequence that's proven to work well. Okay, so we often think of systematic as, oh, I bought a box of XYZ readers or whatever. And that is a product that has a system that teachers can use. But it's not necessarily systematic instruction in the thing that your child needs, or one child needs, phonemic awareness. Okay, it might be a system to organize the books that this company produces, and they might be wonderful books, but it's not a systematic instruction for the following components of reading. And they're listed here: phonemic awareness, phonics, vocabulary development, reading fluency, including oral reading skills, and reading comprehension strategies. Okay, so right here, you can, just copy these, or I'll send them to Cheatham so she can have it for people who, are watching this and would like a printout of it. But just having these for parents is the best tool going for figuring out where your child is in reading. If we look at the blue section, what stage of reading is my child at? Do they know all of the phonemes and the speech sounds and how to connect them to print? And how do I know that? What was measured? Okay, and I'm not, supporting one program or another. There's loads of programs out there. Not many do all of this well, but many do some of it well. So if your child needs to know those sounds and letter connections, and you have an evidence-based program, for instance, the Orton-Gillingham or the Wilson program, which is based on the Orton-Gillingham program, will have measures at the end of lessons to say, these are the speech sounds we studied in step 1, and this is your child's mastery of them at the end of the unit or the step. And, by the time they get to step 6, they'll know these sounds and how to spell them in these ways. So the measurement of the speech sounds and connecting them to print needs to be very clear to parents. Again, there's 44 speech sounds, so it's kind of easy to measure or to ask your teachers, well, which of the phonemes can he recognize and spell? Which of the phonemes, when you have dictation, can he write down? Okay, so I might have a spelling test where I say, okay, I'm going to ask you to spell the sound J. And so a new student might only put the letter J down. Okay, but someone who has learned more phonemes would know that the G followed by an I, like giraffe, also makes that sound. But that's a very advanced skill. But if at some point kids need to know all of them to read fluently and to be able to put them together. So So let's take a break from that for a second and notice that this is a really good tool for parents. We'll just sort of sum up to know each stage, and also to use it as a measure of what kind of instruction. So the blue section tells us what particular area of reading children might need. They need all of them. But so if you have a program where you're working 30 or 60 minutes a day on phonemes and speech sounds, what are we doing about background knowledge? Okay, so I get a lot of calls from different families, and let's imagine that there's a family that calls and says, what can I do? My child's in 5th grade, but is, just beginning to do decoding and phonics and just starting. And so they're really reading it below the 2nd grade level, but they're in 5th grade. And all of the class, has science homework to read, has social studies reports they'd like to do, or book reports. How do I get that for my child? Well, when you look at the sufficient background information and vocabulary, how do we get them to access that at their grade level, at their interest level, if they're not reading well? Because now in 5th grade, you're in those read to learn years. That's where accommodations will come in. So anytime that your child is not accessing what everybody else, what his peers would and should be accessing to learn all the other curriculum, science, social studies, even art and math, then you want to make sure that the course is not taught so heavily on reading to learn without accommodating that student and giving them access to the background information. And the way I often explain it is, I'm going to switch off. I think everybody got a good look at this, right? So let's switch off that for a second. Okay, so what I often say to parents is that your child has been reading at different levels. So there is reading at different levels. So if you have a child that is reading at the Frog and Toad are Friends level, does everybody know that book? It's got like a few sentences on each page. It starts with Frog and Toad are friends. And then you turn the page, So if your child is struggling to learn to decode and they're just on this path because, I don't know, they were missed before or whatever, you're here's where you are with a 5th grader that can't really read Frog and Toad are Friends, or maybe they're reading at a little bit better than that, like those Little Bear books or Amelia Bedelia, and there's little paragraphs, okay? If you visually think of what those books look like, there's more words, more sentence structure, more complex language. Language gets more and more complex as the kids get older. The language takes a turn. Frog and Toad are friends, and some of the Amelia Bedelia books in the early readers, they keep pace with what any person would learn to, would be able to do from speaking and conversation. Okay, there's not a lot of complex syntax in Frog and Toad are Friends. There's not but we don't speak the way, if you read Charlotte's Web, which many 4th graders and 5th graders would, enjoy. They're longer sentences, more complex vocabulary, things that we don't normally talk about. The perspective that we explain stories in changes, and it gets more complex as kids get older. So if your child is stuck with their independent reading level in the Frog and Toad world, not only are they missing the content of science or whatever that content is, but also the experience of that more complex language that you only get from literature, because we don't speak that way. So another reason to make sure that if 3rd graders are reading Frindle or Double Fudge or whatever 3rd graders these days are reading, you want your child to experience that language, even if it's not directly reading it, even if it's listening to the stories and following along, or listening with you as a parent. When they get their little scholastic book order sheet, most schools still have those as far as I know, and all the kids are ordering, whatever the cool thing is, but your child can't read those things well. By all means, let them order one, get the book on tape or get it through Learning Ally or Bookshare or Audible, and follow along, because not providing it leaves us not having the background of information and the vocabulary that their peers are very quickly accumulating. And it's an exponential accumulation. If you are reading, the kids that are reading are gaining all this language and linguistical experience that kids who are not reading can't get anywhere else except from literature. Now, they don't have to actually read it. They just have to experience it. But ideally, we do want them to be able to read it, right? So catching up with the phonics and the decoding and the reading fluency generally takes about 2.5 years. So anyone that's telling you, oh, in 40 minutes I can cure your child if you, put on blue lenses and tap your nose 5 times or something, that doesn't work. It takes time to teach kids to read. And if kids have missed some of those foundational skills, you actually have to go all the way back, starting with phonemic awareness, which doesn't even involve letters. Phonemic awareness is just sounds and manipulating the sounds of language. You have to go all the way back, make sure they have those foundational skills, and from wherever they are, because kids will be on different rungs of the ladder, say, of building this foundation, from wherever they are, you need to pick it up and make sure they get what they need. There'll be kids that have great working memories and great visual memories, so they'll have memorized whole words and maybe even do okay on 1st or 2nd grade spelling tests because they have good memories. And there are other kids that don't do as well at that. But those same kids that do well in 1st and 2nd grade are well enough. In 3rd grade for fluency, that might be the area where they're having trouble. And so they never get past 2nd or 3rd grade fluency, and they have more trouble in comprehending because they're not reading fluently. If you can imagine that a child has trouble connecting sound to print, and that's what the problem is for kids with dyslexia, making that connection. If you have trouble putting and p together to map, and then you read a long sentence out of Mary Poppins or Charlotte's Web with its clauses and descriptors, putting that all together and to create meaning is just as complicated, if not more. So some kids will have trouble with comprehension or reading fluency based on their need for explicit instruction in word order in the English language and syntax in the English language. And some languages are easier than others. So the syntax and grammar of, say, like Latin or German or French is very different than the syntax and grammar in English. So that's the kind of explicit, and that's the topic, but explicit and systematic instruction in word study, grammar, syntax is also just as important as explicit and systematic instruction in decoding. Decoding's one of the first things, you've got to get that, but a lot of people say, okay, well now he can decode, but he's just not reading fluently, and that's all we can do. No, we need explicit and systematic instruction in every one of these, and Congress got it right. So they base it on the National Reading Panel survey, where experts studied the neuroscience of this. The research is very clear and it's there. So Congress listened to that research and came up with this definition and these components of reading instruction. So I don't know, I've talked quite a bit now, but I hope that's helpful for parents. If you go to an IEP meeting and, maybe your child is struggling and you're not sure, does my goal make sense? Does this goal make sense? Well, you have to sort of look at these components of reading and the components of instruction and say, you know, where is my child? Where's their present level? So if my child's decoding pretty well, they've gone through some systematic phonics instruction that's evidence-based, and we're pretty sure that they're decoding multisyllable words, they're decoding nonsense words, things are going well, but their fluency is slow. First, you want to know that. What is the fluency? Just like you want to know which phonemes can they connect to text, what is their fluency? What is fluency in general? Never mind what's their fluency. What is fluency? So fluency is a triple threat. You need to be able to decode accurately, so that fluency is accuracy, and rate, the speed of which you do it. So words per minute. In fact, usually that's what people think of when they think of fluency. They think of how many words per minute. But it's also prosody. And prosody is the cadence and intonation that you read with. So if you remember, the old original voice to text would, you know, sound like this. And they might pronounce words like we know your name is Cheatham. They might say Sidim or something. You know, they might create some other mispronunciation. So the ability to accurately read with the correct rate and the correct prosody is how we measure fluency. But the prosody, or the ability to sound natural, is not something that's the end result, like rehearsed lines in a play. So if the school is measuring fluency by, you know, in cold reads, or initially without any practice, the child reads, you know, 35 words a minute. But with some practice and redirection, the child can do it, she doubles it. It's 70 words. I'm just making those numbers up, but it's 70 words per minute. So we're increasing fluency. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Because if the child is hearing the corrected version and just memorizing it, some kids are really good at that, especially in the, you know, 3rd and 4th grade. Then they're memorizing like lines in a play. And if you took those same words and gave them a new cold read in you know, a different context, different text, but using the same types of vocabulary and the same letter structure, and they'd still be at 30-something words per minute instead of the 70. Then their fluency is really the 30 words. So practice is a great thing to do. It's important to practice and to get correction and learn. But fluency itself is measured in the natural prosody that someone would read just coldly reading oral reading. One of a very good, valid, efficient predictor of that is the GORT, the Gray's Oral Reading Test, has a fluency measure. There's other ways to do it as well, but it's not rehearsed reading. It's not practiced reading. Now, that doesn't mean that practice is a bad thing. It just means that doesn't give you a good understanding of what fluency is. Okay, so I think what we've talked about now, I have to take a look here, is the ability to decode words and then reading fluently, so rate, accuracy, and prosody. Those are all the foundational things. Once you have that, comprehension, things like that follow. But they also support it. So it's sort of like, you know, almost, you know, what a yin and yang looks like. So the foundational skills are kind of on one side, and the comprehension and how to get meaning from text and motivation are on the other side, and they balance one another. So you don't want to have, you know, a child just learning in isolation decoding. But without decoding, you're not going to get reading, you know, so it really is a combination of things. But you also want to know, where's your child's deficit? So if your child has no problem, and you can tell this by looking at assessments like their WISC verbal comprehension on the Wessler Intelligence Scale for Children. I often start parents right there. If the verbal comprehension is in the average range or above, then your child is not really having a problem comprehending language. Okay? The verbal comprehension in the WISC is measured by the test giver reading the text and then asking the questions. So the child never actually reads in that particular measure. So that gives you an idea. Also, you know your child. When you read a story, can they tell you who the main character is and such? So kids that don't have that issue, when they get their pullout, when they get their specialized education plan, you want the specialized education to target the deficit, which for most kids with dyslexia is going to start with the decoding and go into syntax, grammar, morphology, things that help fluency. Does that make sense?
That makes sense, yes.
Do you have any questions?
It's really individuals, and the schools have to provide something that is unique for that child, not just this is what we think it is. And with all the practices that a parent can do at home, they can figure out what those deficits are and look at the IPs and see if it's actually matching what the child needs.
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest like bringing these with you to your IEP meeting and saying, here are the 5 parts of the reading system according to Congress. What do we have to show us that my child knows A? Mm-hmm. And that's the connecting sounds to text. And if they're not talking about 44 phonemes and showing you data that says, yes, he or she knows these, well, you need to go back and make sure they do. Mm-hmm. The ability to decode unfamiliar words, nonsense words, and a good valid predictor, not like, Miss Jones thinks my child can do this, but show me data, show me valid and reliable assessment that measures the ability to read fluently like a Gort. And then sufficient background knowledge, if your child's WISC is showing that they are average or above, or even low average, because low average is still average, then that's not an issue. Okay, and the development of appropriate active strategies. This is talking about providing students with the tools they need for word attack skills, because we're always going to see new words. You can be a college student, you can be, an older person saying, I got it with a new hobby, and you're going to open some new topic and you're going to find new words. So kids need the tools for word attack skills and for the skills that will help them attack text from the paragraph level, from the essay level, on the literature level. So those types of skills, how to break down sentences, how to break down words, actually also helps them write, because writing is the expressive version, right? Mm-hmm. So kids that get these skills explicitly taught will also become better writers.
I hear from parents that sometimes schools say, oh, we have teachers who have a certification, not maybe a full training on OG methods or some kind of multisensory training. But I always get the question, are they really the right skills? Do they have the right skills and training to teach my children? Could you touch on that a little bit?
Well, you're always going to have, I've gone to IEP meetings where they say, well, everyone on our team is a highly trained, but they don't tell you what the training is. It sort of depends on where your child is in this progression. But if you're sitting around an IEP table and you slide this over and you say, which phonemes does my child know? And they're all looking at you like, what's a phoneme? I often tell parents to sort of be Columbo, know everything and ask good questions to find out what the team knows. So if you say, I have this description of reading, who here at the team can tell me, how well my child does A? the skills and knowledge to understand phonemes or speech sounds. Now, you might know that there are 44 because I just told you, but ask, how many? What is a phoneme? See who answers, okay? Because you really do want a teacher who understands the brain activity involved in learning to read. It's hard to do on a video conference like this, but if you think of a triangle, okay, and on this side of the bottom of the triangle is like an ear and lips, and on the other side of the triangle is eyes, so visual input and speech and language input, and the top is getting meaning from it, semantics, making sense of it all. Our brains get lots of information from our senses, from what we see, from what we hear, and what other people say and what we say. So how do you get your eyes to hear the sounds that the letters represent? Okay, that's a process. For some kids, once they're taught some of the letters and the sounds, they pick it up quite quickly. But your brain is sending messages, up and down the triangle. Like if you see a tiger coming at you, you know to run. You don't need any letters to tell you that. Your brain sees that thing and moves up. I wish I had a good visual. I do have one in one of my presentations, but I didn't think to have it for today. But the same with speech. Kids that can do well on that WISC program, they're getting input from speech and language, and they're making sense out of it pretty well. And you know that because when you look at their WISC, their verbal comprehension is great. The problem is this one right here, from seeing letters on a page and connecting it to sounds of speech so that they can then, run it up the pole to make meaning. Because the letters themselves, without a connection to speech, mean nothing. So I could send you the Chinese or the Slovakian version of a great collection of early to middle school readers in a nice package with a bow on it, and it can be colored and leveled and and gradually increase. But if you don't know what the markings on the page mean as far as connecting them to the sound, and you don't comprehend that language, that little box isn't going to help you, because you need to know not only the language, this side of the triangle here, but also the how to connect sound to it. So I didn't bring the book, although this is one of them. This is Language at the Speed of Sight. And there's also a book called by Stanislaw Dehaene on the reading in the brain. To put all this together, scientists know that we need to connect the squiggles on the page to actual speech sounds of the language we're trying to read. And if that's the problem, we need to build a good pathway down here on the bottom of the triangle. And we do that by connecting text to speech sounds. And, amazingly enough, Congress has spelled that out. The skills and knowledge to understand how speech sounds or phonemes are connected to print. If you can't do that, you're not going to get to read. Now, there will be kids that will memorize a lot of whole words, okay? And actually, some of us, we all memorize some whole words, and we read more fluently over time. But if you can't get those minimal pieces, the most smallest pieces of sound to connect to text, you won't get above a second or third grade reading level. And so that's kind of what the process parents need to understand. And you can, like I said, you can use this this description by Congress as your tool in these meetings to ask teachers. And if they don't seem to know how this all works, the chances of them being helpful for your child are not as good as if they did know this. So it's hard, for sitting here, you and I, to say like which teachers don't know what they're doing, which teachers know what they're doing. all teachers, nobody gets into the profession of teaching. Pretty much all teachers are trying to help your child. But if your child has a specific learning disability, and dyslexia is one, then they need someone who understands this process in a detailed and scientific way and has the skills and the training to build that connection between the speech sounds and the written text and everything that follows after it in an explicit and systematic way. A lot of times parents also say to me, my school doesn't recognize dyslexia. I'd like to share, for those parents, what do we do when the school doesn't understand dyslexia or even acknowledge dyslexia? I would say to you that even if they don't say dyslexia, reading and the components are the same. Reading is reading, so whether they say dyslexia or not, they're supposed to do all those things if your child is struggling. But also, let's take a look at what specific learning disability is, because that's one of the categories that's most likely to be on your child's IEP. So IDEA law has 13 different categories of disabilities. Specific learning disability is one. But I asked my parents that I'm working at to print this out. You can see it on our website. You can find it on our website. But it's actually a component of the law. And it tells you exactly what specific learning disability includes. And so when you have this on the IEP, and you say, well, it's a specific learning disability, but there are many, which one does my child have? And then you take this out and you look through it and you cross them out. You say, does anyone at the table think my child has perceptual disabilities? And, they're gonna look at you and usually silence. So, okay, well, let's cross that one out because we don't have any data or information that my child would have that. Brain injury. I can say as the parent, my child does not have a brain injury. Minimal brain dysfunction. Is there anyone at the table that's going to diagnose my child with minimal brain dysfunction? Again, you'll get silence because they don't have the qualification to do that, so you cross that out. Dyslexia. Well, that's what my specialist that I got privately says my child has, trouble with reading. But let's put that on hold for a second. Developmental aphasia. Does my child have that? Is there anyone on the team that thinks that my child has developmental aphasia? Again, you'll get silence and you cross that out. So now let's look at dyslexia and look at what it is. And we had already talked about what the definition of dyslexia is. So you can slide that across the table and say, this is dyslexia, a trouble with the phonological processes of reading. We can see that in my child's testing. They have trouble with phonemic awareness. They have trouble with rapid naming or naming speed. Those are the two key indicators. We didn't really get into that in this thing, but if you're talking about dyslexia, you probably already have that in your child's file. So it has to be dyslexia. And they say, oh, but we don't use dyslexia. We don't use that. Well, slide right down here on our website and you'll see this document. And this document is from a guidance letter, and it's about 4 pages long, and you can download it. But basically, it says, and I sort of summarized it over here for you, that states should review their policies and use the word dyslexia when it's indicated. And so if you've scratched out all the other possibilities of specific learning disability, and you think as a parent and based on the assessments that your child is having problems with phonological processing and connecting print to text, then that's dyslexia. And in addition, it says the IEP must address the child's needs resulting from the child's disability. In other words, specific to that child's disability. So a child who is blind needs to have Braille. A child who has severe hearing impairment needs American Sign Language. And a child who's dyslexic needs the instruction or the right tools to access, their needs, specific to their needs. And it says also that the personnel responsible for the IEP implementation, that would be your teachers, okay, would need to know about the condition underlying the child's disability. So if you have someone there and they say, oh, well, she's a reading specialist or she's our special ed tutor or whatever, but doesn't and can't explain to you what her training specifically in dyslexia is, well, then I think you have a good basis to ask some important questions about that person's ability to provide services. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot. And I believe it was on one of the conferences that I've been to, and you were one of the panelists there. They were saying that when you go to an IEP meeting, if your school isn't giving the right tools to your child, then bring a tape recorder. If that doesn't work, bring an advocate. And that doesn't work, bring a lawyer. And you'll get what you need, which is like a step-by-step process.
Well, that's kind of a long process. I mean, I would say to all parents, for every IEP, for every disability, first of all, you've got usually 4 or more school professionals, and I've been on that side of the IEP table as well. You've got all these professionals alongside you. Maybe you're 2 spouses, husband, wife, whatever, or not. But usually it's one parent and a multitude of school professionals. And you might have some notes, but here everybody's talking. They're going to use academic language and assessment language and things that for parents, at least starting out, it's all new. I would say a few days before every meeting, and some schools will let you just put it in their permanent file, I will be recording every meeting. I cannot, listen and participate in the meeting and take notes like a stenographer at the same time. And so I really need this to happen, and you have a right to ask, and I don't know of anyone, any reason why they would tell you you can't. I do know that the school needs notice, because as a school professional, if someone was recording a meeting, we also from the school had to record the meeting. So you need to give them notice so that it doesn't hold up the meeting. But there really isn't any reason that I know of that you wouldn't want to record every meeting.
That's a great tip.
Download them or whatever. So that, I'm not so sure you want to try so many things and wait for them to fail to go to the next one. Just do that one anyway, because it can't help but help you. I mean, you're going to benefit from having the meeting recorded. The trouble with the IEP meeting, if let's just say worst case scenario, not every school will be like this, but everyone around the table either doesn't know about dyslexia or is not admitting they know anything about dyslexia and truly doesn't have what your child needs. And the parent is also on the learning curve of, I'm beginning this, I'm not really sure what I'm asking, but I was told to ask this, so I'm going to ask for it. If everybody kind of doesn't know, an advocate alone isn't going to help, because an advocate can be on your side and be on that side of the table with you, but if they don't understand or recognize those components of reading, or where what the school is providing is strong and where what the school is providing is not strong, you can feel like you got your way, but maybe the advocate doesn't know as much about reading as they need to. So since advocates are not really regulated, I think it's important for parents to make sure they understand what reading is. And I'm certainly not saying don't bring advocates. Advocates are good. But you want to ask their advocates the same questions you're asking your instructors. What do you know about the essential components of reading? What do you know about the definition of reading? How do I look at these assessments? In fact, the person doing your assessments, whether it's a school psychologist or your own individual private evaluator, that's the person that you want to say, okay, well, here's the components, connect these assessments to these components. Which one of these assessments in the pile of papers that you get, show me about phonemic awareness? Where is naming speed? Which one of these subtests is really talking about naming speed? Which one of these subtests is talking about reading fluency? And so that you know what your assessments are saying, and you're matching them up with the skills they need to learn to read. And then as a team, whether you have an advocate or an attorney or just the team, sometimes the school is actually helping. Most of the time they really do want to help most kids. But to see things, when somebody starts to put this on the table and say, look, this is where my child's falling behind. They have no ability, or they decode okay, they have no ability to do it fluently. They're too slow. And so, so they need help with fluency. What's the evidence-based way that we can get fluency? And that brings me to the other thing. Again, not that I'm saying not to use lawyers and advocates, because many times you're up against stuff that you just have to do that, but that's, another topic. Think about what evidence-based means. So if you remember, we talked about the different essential components. Another part of Congress's information that it specifically talks about for reading is scientifically based reading research. The term scientifically based reading research means research, and then it goes on to explain, what that means. And I would encourage parents to learn about what's the method that a teacher is going to use and their training in it. And a lot of times teachers like to talk about products. Okay, so there's lots of products out there for reading. But if the only research is the company or the publisher of that product, I don't want to get in trouble by naming any particular product, but say that I'm going to make this up. So if there really is a product, I don't know about it, but I'm making this up, fake product, okay? If there's a product called, Whistle to Read or something, and it has this method where, kids are whistling and learning to read at the same time. I'm just totally making this up, okay? But you go onto the website and it has an app and it's nice and shiny, and they probably even have a little brain image there to tell you that it's, based on something. And then you look at the research, because they always have some little thing where you can look at the research. And it says, in Miss Jones's class in, one town anywhere USA, of the 30 kids in the first grade and the 30 kids in the second grade, they all improved their reading, whistling to read, or whatever the research is. That's not scientific, okay? Scientific is, over time, in a varied study with all diverse populations and all kinds of validity tests applied to it, there was a control group, kids that got the program against kids that didn't get the program. And it was done as equally and fairly as possible to know or to validate that the progress in that program that we see is because of the program. And so there's something called What Works Clearinghouse. And so people will say, oh, it's on What Works Clearinghouse, so that must mean it's good. No, click on the What Works Clearinghouse. And sometimes it says, no discernible evidence. So kids did well, but would they have done just as well no matter what other program was used? We don't know, because there was no discernible evidence that was the reason that the kids did well. I'm not sure I'm making this clear, but you want to be very suspicious or very investigative of whatever method's being used and find out. Now, if you click on What Works Clearinghouse or the research that they're selling, in the marketing department of, Whistle to Read or whatever, you want to make sure that the claims that they're making are even for your child. Now, I just was on one recently, okay, let's say Whistle to Read, and it says, so-and-so teacher designed this because that teacher had, so many students and needed them to practice while he did something else. So that the goal in this program if you read it correctly, is to help teachers give their kids something to do while they're doing something else. Now, teachers do have to do something else sometimes. But if your child has on their IEP 30 times 5, that means they're supposed to get 30 minutes of individualized or group, depending on what the IEP says, direct explicit instruction. And now we go back to the IEP. Remember, Congress said direct, systematic, explicit instruction, not busy work to practice. Now, practice is totally important. We need to have practice, but your child's IEP time is supposed to be instructional time. So there's a lot of ways you can be a better consumer about what's happening around your child's IEP.
And that's a great point. It's not 30 minutes of getting out of the classroom, picking up your books, going to the next classroom, settling down, and then doing the work for 15 minutes and wrapping things up and going back to your classroom. It's 30 minutes of instructional time.
Well, yes. I mean, there is the factor of going from, if you have to get up and move to go to another classroom, that's included. I mean, you know, within reason, everybody else, all their peers, when the 30 minutes, say everybody gets 30 minutes of science or 45 minutes of science. Everybody needs to stand, walk down the hall. They usually put in about 3 minutes transition time in the schedules anyway, at least in some schools. So within reason. But if your child is, if 15 minutes is taken up getting settled because they have to, you know, do something else, or they're supposed to do busy work before it's their turn for the instruction, that's not the same as everyone in the school who gets about 3 or 4 minutes transition time. Mm-hmm. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like they're supposed to have the same type of transition time that you would include in any schedule. Like, we don't want to be unreasonable. But if what you think is instructional time within a reasonable context of 45 minutes, you know, 40 minutes of it ought to be instruction. And instruction does involve practice. So say you're doing a Wilson phonics lesson, okay? So you're going to have some time that's spent directly instructing about that sound and the symbol that represents it. You're going to have some review time. You're going to have some time where there's a dictation and the child has to write and show how they've mastered it or how they're doing. There's going to be some exercises or practices. And it's okay for the teacher, especially if they're doing a group instruction, to let the child work on something that they just went over and then go and give the other, some other child some other instruction as well. Like I said, within reason. But if your child is showing up for their IEP time and they're picking up their packet and signing onto a computer and practicing with the computer for the entire 30 minutes, or even for most of the 30 minutes, then most of the 30 minutes was on a computer program, which is never direct explicit instruction. It's good practice, perhaps. It's not like all computer programs are bad. And the teacher might even use the computer program and engage in it. So it's very hard to sort of just judge blatantly, like, oh, it has to be set the timer at 30 minutes or whatever. But it has to be reasonable and reasonably explicit and sequential. Anytime they're saying, well, we do a little bit of this and a little bit of that, is not a good sign. Because you want, if it's explicit and systematic, you want to know what the system is. All right. So if there's a system of instruction, not a system of here's the box of books, we're on the yellow books, we're not on the blue books. That's just categorizing. Interesting, helpful sometimes, but that's not a system of instruction. A system of instruction is like, math. You don't usually teach division before you've mastered addition and subtraction and multiplication and then division.
Okay, so I'll just say good deal.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much, Nancy, for all the information you shared with us and all of our parents.
Thank you. It was a pleasure to do this. I know I kind of feel like I'm always rambling, but if anyone has any questions, they can find us on the Decoding Dyslexia Massachusetts Facebook page or our website. I hope you'll explore our website for some of these things in the future.
And I will include the links in the bottom. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks. Take care.